Welcome to today's webinar entitled Shared Service Centers, Efficient Space Utilization that Reflects Institutional Priorities. My name's Billy Zadig, Manager of Special Programs for APA. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. The webinar recording will be posted to the APA website later this afternoon. Please visit our website at www.apa.org to register for upcoming events and to view archived webinars for continuing education credits found under the Continuous Learning tab. APA-U is back live in person and will be in Providence, Rhode Island next week and in Fort Worth, Texas in January of 2023. Information is available on the APA website under the CLS tab. Professional continuing education certificates are being offered for today's program. AIA members who need their attendance reported to AIA should contact me at Billie, B-I-L-L-I-E, at apa.org. Those who indicated they wanted a certificate at registration and meet the requirements will receive certificates later this afternoon. All attendees are in listen-only mode. Please type your questions in the chat box and they will be answered in the order they are received. If we run out of time and we still have questions, responses will be sent directly to the person asking the question by our presenters. If you're just calling in, make sure to send me an email at billie@apa.org so I can send you a certificate if you would like one. The system only recognizes you if you log in. At this time, it's my pleasure to turn this over to Carolyn Farley, who will introduce our speakers for today. Carolyn, take it away.
Thank you so much, Billie. We appreciate the opportunity to be here today. And I will do a quick introduction of myself and ask my co-presenters, Melissa and Lee, to do the same. My name is Carolyn Farley. I am a director with Huron Consulting, having worked on university campuses for 25 plus years, with responsibility for facilities and operations for both academic and student life facilities and renovation and construction over the course of the years. One of the case studies that we'll refer to today at the University of Alabama, Birmingham is one that Lee and I actually had a chance to work on together. So we love to tell this story. Melissa, I'll ask you to introduce yourself, please. Melissa, can you hear me?
2.5 years later, and I still forget the mute button. Hi, my name's Melissa Long-Shooter, and I'm the Executive Director of Operation Support Services with the University of Louisville, which includes a shared service operation.
Great. And Lee?
Good afternoon and good morning, everybody. Thank you for your time today. I'm Lee Smith. I am a managing director with the Huron Consulting Group, but prior to joining Huron, I spent the entirety of my career in higher education, worked for 3 different institutions in a variety of administrative and operational roles, and had the opportunity to lead shared services efforts both on the student side of the house and on the faculty staff side of the house. So looking forward to our conversation today. Carolyn?
Great, thank you. So to get us started and to fulfill some expectations of the AIA, we're going to share our course description. So shared service centers represent an operational efficiency and space management opportunity, both for the center itself and for the offices that it represents that are no longer customer facing. Many institutions are considering ways in which they can operate more efficiently post-pandemic, and space utilization and streamlining of academic services are top of mind for campus leadership. And our objectives for today are to define shared services, and you'll note that there are a couple of different types of shared service centers that we'll touch on. How to assess the nature of the activities and how this translates into space requirements. We will identify how a shared service center can reflect new organizational priorities through space allocation and utilization. We will set expectations and find opportunities to continuously improve on this new normal, if we're there at this point. We'll detail the impact on the future of work and workspaces on campus, and we will manage the shared services transition most effectively to best position these units for success. So to get us started, I will ask Lee to come on camera and to talk through this first slide, couple of slides.
Yeah, thanks, Carolyn. So I'd like to start by covering what we mean by shared services. And I think one of the important concepts here is that shared services does not have just a single meaning in terms of how it could be realized on your campuses. At a very basic level, shared services refers to the idea that you're going to have a group of employees that are providing service or support to multiple units, departments, schools, colleges, etc., simultaneously. Now, we'll walk through some details about how that can look different at different institutions. So when we think about a shared services operating model, though, there are a number of key considerations. And when I use the term operating model, I'm simply meaning that phrase to refer to how institutions get work done. And so it should always start with strategy. What are the strategies that executive leadership is laying out, and how can shared services help to achieve those overall institutional goals? We then often talk about centers of expertise. Some institutions call these centers of excellence as well. These are groups of individuals who have deep knowledge in particular functions. It could be human resources, it could be general finance, it could be procurement, it could be IT. There are a whole number of areas where you may want to look as a campus for specialized knowledge. These centers of expertise are often located within the central administration of an organization, and they tend to focus on certain elements: the development of institution-wide policies, tracking compliance with certain federal, state, or institutional requirements, pushing continuous quality improvement across certain areas of service. We then often see individuals that we refer to as business partners who really start to build a bridge between these centers of expertise and local units, departments, schools, etc., around campus. These business partners and HR organizations have been using business partners for a number of years, but we're starting to see these spread into other areas of the organization. These business partners really function in an expert liaison role, where you're working with leadership in different units across campus to help them solve their problems that may need HR support or finance support or procurement support, etc. The next element is a service center. And service centers can take a variety of different looks, but service centers tend to be focused on transactions and helping different stakeholders around campus to get their transactions completed accurately and efficiently. Often the individuals that staff these service centers are focused on a subset of transactions where they reach a level of expertise with them that, as I like to say, they know the exceptions to the exceptions with these. Our goal is in a future state often that we want to see 80% of customer or stakeholder interactions take place with the service center. And we want to see less of those interactions actually having to go into the business partners and the centers of expertise. We want to see business partners and centers of expertise spending more of their time on strategic elements, where a lot of the transactional and tactical elements are taking place in the service center. Finally, at the base of the pyramid here is self-service. And certainly as your technology allows, you want to be able to create opportunities for individuals to complete transactions without having to rely on others on campus. So these are the elements that often comprise a shared services delivery model. But if we go to the next slide, I want to illustrate that this can take a variety of different formats. You see here across the top that there are 5 different basic models, and that for each of these, there can be differences in to whom they report. Do they report to the dean of a school or a college, or do they report to the lead of HR, the lead of finance, etc.? Sometimes you have dotted line reporting that's included. The funding models for these can vary quite a bit depending on what the budget model for your institution is, whether there are chargebacks included, whether this is built into the base budget of the institution. And of course, a particular interest for the group on the call today is where are they physically located? Sometimes we see these being deployed on campuses in locations that are very close to where the customers or the stakeholders would be. Other times we see them paired up with where central HR is located or central finance. These are all decisions you have to make along the way, again, according to what your points of emphasis will be. If we go to the next slide, though, we do find that there are a core set of success factors, and I'd like to go through these quickly. When you're transitioning from a current state to a future state where you're going to change the operating model and the way that you really deliver these services to campus, we find that there's 5 core elements to success. First is that you have to engage a broad set of stakeholders around campus. This is not an operating model that you tend to be able to design with only a few executive leaders in the room. Our experience is that having deep, meaningful conversations with different customers around campus, understanding what works well and what needs to work better, is the best way to move forward. Second is efficient processes, but ensuring that these processes are designed with those end customer needs in mind. Third is around governance. Who's going to make decisions? How are they going to make decisions? And is that decision-making process going to be transparent? Fourth is around communication. If you're making a change in the future, why are you making the change? And really communicating the why. There are a lot of details when you're making a shift like this that you need to describe about what will change in the future, but we always encourage people to begin with the why. And finally, this concept of active sponsorship, where all leaders within the organization have a responsibility to support the change in the future state. So again, all of these are critical to success. The one that is particularly important, though, is this idea of active sponsorship and the responsibilities that your different leaders have to support success. So with that, I think we would like to transition over to some specific case study examples. And Carolyn, I'll invite you to talk a little bit about UAB.
Great, thanks so much, Lee. As I mentioned, Lee and I had a chance to be a part of standing this service center up. It was back in the fall of 2012, so it's been around for a while. And the impetus behind the development was that we had a plan to renovate the student center in which this particular area was located, along with about 55,000 square feet of other offices, the registrar, student accounts, financial aid, the graduate school, all of these student-facing offices that weren't necessarily aligned with a true student center model would be moving out of the student center, not only because we were tearing it down to rebuild a new on site, but they would not be moving back. The goal of the student center was to really bring the co-curricular experience into that facility, to really turn more space back to the students. And so some of these student services offices would be represented in the building in the one-stop shop. And we got started with financial aid, student accounts, the registrar's office. That was kind of how things really got off the ground. And you'll notice that some of these are represented, a very specific statement of account analysis. Others are addressed as this office is able to answer dining questions. And I use that example because that was an area of my responsibility. And I wanted them to be able to provide basic information, but I wasn't turning over the responsibility of granting exceptions to the dining policy. that was still going to be handled elsewhere, but it was helpful for them to be able to kind of manage that front line, help a student find the website type of activity that could be addressed in this setting. And so this facility was built in the old student center and operated there for about 2 years, at which point it moved into a temporary location. And mind you, neither of these were very shiny or exciting when it came to their physical arrangement. That happened when they moved back into the student center. But our goal with getting them established in the old building was that students would have created the habit of connecting with the One Stop. They would find it on that interim basis, and they would find it when it came back into the Hill Student Center. So these were all very intentional moves intended to really reinforce the utilization of this function. And as you will see here, there are a couple of visuals of the space. In that lower right-hand corner are their stats over the past several years. And you can see kind of some steady growth, a little couple of dips, particularly there in 2020 when they weren't in person. But they did a really remarkable pivot to covering a lot of things remotely using chat functions. They were busier on the phone. Certainly email was a big part of what they were able to accomplish, but through it all, they did some really great tracking, and you can see that even in this last year, things ticked up once again. I want to bring your attention to kind of the physical arrangement of the space. That upper right picture is the reception desk for this particular office. This office is set up to receive the students that are walking in for service. If there is a line, if there is a wait for that service, they are able to log into an electronic queuing system that will send a message to their phone when it's their turn. So if they'd like to leave the center to go and get a cup of coffee or to sit down with a friend in another part of the building, they will be notified when it's their turn. The reception function, when they return, then directs them to the individual staff person. And what you see on the left here is an example of the workstation that a staff member would occupy. They were not enclosed spaces. They were open workstations. If there was a need for private space, there were some small meeting rooms that were available to have a student join a staff member. Perhaps parents were along. They would have a place where they could adjourn that would be out of the main flow of traffic. But really, we found that the vast majority of interactions could be handled in this open atmosphere. The use of some white or pink noise in the background helps to kind of manage the disruption of conversation from one workstation to another, and is something to certainly be taken into consideration. That reception area, and you'll see a couple of other examples in these images, that self-service function is available for many things that students want to do. They may just not know it. And so one of the things that I like to point out is a student may come into the space, interact with the receptionist, find out that there are things that they can accomplish online on their own, but they may not want to leave the space until they've actually accomplished that task. So having some space for them to sit down, you know, work away on their phone, maybe even open their computer and plug away at what they're trying to do, check in if they're having an issue, but really making it a welcoming space so that they feel like it's not just about the transaction, but about really accomplishing the task that they are there to accomplish. On the flip side of this is kind of a service counter in a bank arrangement. For those of you, they still have you queue in a single line and step up to the next available teller if that's what you are there to do. And this very much mimics that approach to providing service. So you would have several people working at a single counter. Any of them would be able to respond to the question or the issue at hand, and the line would just keep moving as the next available person becomes available. And I point this out as kind of a nice opportunity to have Melissa join us and talk a bit about the shared service center that they have at the University of Louisville.
Thank you, Carolyn. Hello, everybody. So at the University of Louisville, we stood up a shared service operation just about 6 years ago. And you can see here, we do support things transactionally, departmentally, and strategically. Our basis was that transactional support, and then we inherited through other mergers, departmental and strategic support. And as we have grown over the 6 years, in the next slide, you'll see that we have grown every year. Here you can see the 2022 line is that top line. We measure everything, just about everything we do. So we know that our overall satisfaction rate's 97.8% in FY22. We have 99% satisfaction for that walk-in traffic. We became the COVID response line because we were already set up, and then we work with our health professionals and others to make sure we're delivering the right information on the way our campus responded to the COVID-19 pandemic. And then we also have live chat. So as we are working our space, well, I'll tell you our cheer first. On the next slide, you'll see that when we stood up, and Lee and I worked together during this time, our goal was to be centralized, automated, responsive, data-driven, standardized, and simplified. In the very beginning, you'll see that we hired just over 1,200 new hires and saved over 44,000 sheets of paper when we stood up. We went from a 32-page paper packet where people had to write their names like 19 times, their address so many times, to an automated, we're going to tell you what we already know about you system, and saved all that paper and really helped us look a little more modern as an employer. And so, okay, so talking about our space. So as many of you who, you're tied to your campus, the folks on the business ops team, and you'll see one of our locations on the next slide, we serve 2 campus locations in a face-to-face manner. We do all I-9 federal employment verifications for all employees of the university. So we have to be on campus, at least a portion of the team. And so we are able to centralize that counter location, right? Those counters that require people to be there. And so we're able to help other central offices like our ProCard office, like our payroll office, where they don't have to worry about staffing that desk, particularly during COVID and particularly during just staffing time during our remote work as well. And we also, in addition to the I-9s, we offer free notary service to the campus. So having someone in these locations from 8 to 4:30, Monday through Friday, is really important. The rest of the team has largely stayed remote. And so we released, I think it was 7,500 square feet of space, and 3,700 square feet of space, and built 2,100, which you'll see on the next slide. We built a hoteling space. This hoteling space has that open area. We have cubicles. We also have 4 offices. And I knew my team was never coming back. You'll see the quote there that my coffee's better and I love my bathroom. I heard that on the 18th. We went home on the 17th, up and running on the 18th. And when we huddled together to make sure everybody was on and everybody was working, these were the kind of quotes that people were like, can we do this forever? And at that point, I'm like, I don't know. But as I mentioned, we released this big space that we shared with IT and moved into a space half the size. We use Sign Up Genius to schedule folks into the space. They can sign up for offices, they can sign up for certain stations. We have 2 that have 3 monitors instead of 2. Everything else is equipped with 2 monitors and a universal docking station. And then we're able to manage security. It's a badge in space. So And I will tell you that even the utilization of our hoteling space has been slow, so we've started to open that up to other areas on campus that work in sensitive data. And so, you know, this new work environment on the next slide, as I mentioned, it was 3,400 square feet, 38 workstations, shrunk down to 2,000 square feet with 11 spaces to work and some open collaborative spaces. We've added some whiteboards to that space as well. How do I know it's working? I do an engagement survey every 6 months with the team. It's 12 quick questions. How are we doing? How do you feel about your work environment? And I've been doing this for over 3 years, about 3.5 years. So we had base data before COVID started. And we know that our employees continue to be more engaged and more satisfied in the way that we're managing our work environment. In saying that, we're very intentional and about how we operate in our remote space and in order to achieve our shared service objectives. And then we do have a couple times a year, we'll have in-person activities where we conduct those safely. And in particular, we look to do professional development, team building there. You know, we've been able to use the box and shared files to work on files at the same time. We're a very camera on culture. So with permission to camera off on those days where you just don't want to be on camera. But the team shows up, right? 4 teams, 4 Zoom. And then as you probably figured out from my comments, I love the numbers. So the analytics and the ability to measure and monitor success, to see some early indicators if things are going off the rails, all of that, you know, we work very intentionally to manage. And with that, I will turn back to Carolyn.
And Lee, I'll actually ask you to kind of step into this conversation around the future of the work and the workplace, as we know many campuses are engaged in this conversation, even as we speak.
Yeah, thanks, Carolyn. So as Melissa was just hinting at in some of her comments, we know that these conversations about the way that shared services centers would look and operate looked one way prior to March of 2020, but now we have a different set of realities we're working with. And certainly a lot of questions that I and my teams work through on a regular basis is related to the ability to stand up these centers and understand what is going to take place in person versus what can happen fully remotely versus what does a hybrid scenario look like. So if we shift to the next slide here, we can look at some of the elements that we suggest you look at in really assessing remote work and the feasibility of it for your campus. We do have a lot of institutions who look at this as an opportunity, certainly for financial savings from a variety of different levers. And if you're able to shift some of your operational needs off of campus permanently, or at least mostly shifted off campus, you certainly have the ability to perhaps end some current leases that you have. You might be able to fully vacate other older buildings on campus that maybe are planned for demolition as part of your master plan. And it allows you to leverage your existing space footprint much more effectively. The potential financial opportunities here tend to be very attractive for institutions, but it's not just about the financial opportunity. And we certainly suggest that institutions, as part of this conversation, take a look at their overall space configurations and how those could be better utilized for remote staff. We'll talk a little bit more in a little more detail about this in a few minutes, but I'm sure on many of our campuses, we still see that there's large open spaces that are filled with workstations that just simply aren't being used right now, and being able to ask questions about how those spaces could be better deployed to meet some of the student-facing needs, faculty-facing needs, et cetera, is an important conversation. IT needs are important when you have individuals who are working off campus and they don't have some of the traditional availability to interact face-to-face. You have to ask whether you have the IT tools you need to be successful. And you also have to think about data security and so forth. Finally, your business processes. If you're shifting to a more remote environment, some of your processes may need to change, particularly any of those that have been paper-based in the past. This has actually really been a pleasant surprise for a lot of institutions as they've begun to really be able to use remote work as a catalyst for modernizing a number of their processes and moving it to more of an electronic workflow, or getting away from some of the intense paper. And Melissa certainly provided an example along these lines earlier. So let's go forward a slide if we can, Carolyn. And I wanted to provide some context about what we are hearing in the market. And I'm sure that many of you are feeling this on a day-to-day basis. So we know that during the pandemic, higher education lost a number of employees for a whole variety of reasons, but many campuses still have not fully recovered to the staffing levels that they had pre-pandemic. And it's not necessarily without effort, but we are hearing from a lot of institutions that you have a number of positions that are posted and you're not getting the volume of applicants that you would have expected to get certainly several years ago. And so you're not actually able to hire and fill some of the positions that you need. Some of this extends to the faculty as well, and just some of the economic vulnerability that they feel are actually causing some faculty to consider delaying their retirement, which has cost implications for institutions as well. When we look at some of those statistics here, I think there are a number of interesting points to mention. We're still seeing a high percentage, you see 40% here, of employees are considering a job change this year. We have seen in the age demographic of 30 to 45 that there's been a substantive increase in resignations within that band. And there are, as you know, a lot of individuals in this age demographic that provide administrative support at institutions. And then, of course, some of the senior faculty who are planning to potentially delay their retirement. So the workforce of the future, as we call it for higher education, is a rapidly changing environment, and one which most institutions are reporting a high level of stress in association with right now. So if we go to the next slide here, Carolyn, I think some of the conversations that have to emerge as part of this consideration about the workforce of the future and whether you can provide shared services in a remote or hybrid location, or remote or hybrid format, is really understanding, first of all, your campus culture. Can you shift some of your employees to a permanently remote setup? You may be able to consider that, and some employees may particularly desire that. In fact, to hire some employees, you may have to almost guarantee this as an option. But for some institutions, it doesn't necessarily fit the culture, where particularly at some smaller and mid-sized private institutions, some smaller publics as well, there is kind of a campus culture where people expect to see each other frequently. And so we do see some institutions requiring more presence on campus, or requiring individuals to identify some regular days that they will commit to being in the office, even if a majority of time is off campus. Obviously, there are a number of technology tools that you can use to stay in contact with one another, but still some institutions are valuing that in-person presence. Obviously, from a hybrid work perspective, there are options to reconfigure your space around hoteling, hot desking, et cetera, where again, you can leverage that existing space footprint in a much more impactful way. It may require some investment, and we'll hear Caroline talk about that in a few minutes. But these are complex yet important conversations to have as you begin to understand what that future of work can be, whether you're delivering services to students or to faculty and staff. So with that, Carolyn, I will turn it back over to you for some additional comments.
Thank you, Lee. Wanted to use an example that I had as a takeaway from a conversation with a client recently. And I'd like to preface this by saying that I think one of the things that the pandemic demonstrated is that university space is expensive, whether it's occupied or not. Yes, there might have been some utility savings associated with, the lights are off, those types of things, computers not being plugged in and active, but it's not like we can turn off the systems and hope for a massive savings associated with that. And so the sensitivity around understanding the cost of space, I think, is appropriately on an institution's radar, particularly if they're looking to close a budget gap or if they're mindful of building additional space when they're really not seeing things occupied at the level that they were pre-pandemic. So this is kind of a good example. I was working with a growing institution, and certainly that translates into a growing number of faculty in need of office space. The classroom space that they had is in heavy rotation because with a growing number of students, more class sessions are offered, and that space is more densely occupied when it is scheduled. But with that, there was also the need for some additional academic advisors. And historically, they had worked with a centralized model, but they had outgrown that centralized space. So they started asking departments that these advisors served for office space to house them. So, and that's running up against the fact that they need more office space for faculty. And the only thing that the departments felt they had to convert to office space was classroom space, which too was getting fairly tight. And so, certainly a not an unusual dilemma on campuses these days, but I think the initial reaction was to go for physical space. But what we are learning is that students themselves, according to a survey by Student Voice, have a far different perception of the need to meet in person than we may believe they hold. And so really recommend gauging student expectations for that in-person connection. As I kind of explored things with the campus, one of the things that I found was that many of the academic advisors met with students by Zoom about 80% of the time, which means that there is a comfort level with that. In fact, they had better attendance, like the students showed up for those appointments more often than they showed up for in-person appointments. So there was something that said that was really working for this particular service department. So looking at this differently, rather than saying we need more space, can we more effectively leverage that centralized academic center that already existed, and perhaps have those who would choose rotate in and out of the office with a desk sharing or a hot desking arrangement that allows them to optimize the use of what they currently occupy without having to expand at the expense of other institutional priorities. And so these are the types of things. Sometimes an institution is looking at them at the macro level, like we want to look at all these departments and we're trying to gauge, the effectiveness of service delivery in these various scenarios. And others are looking at it very much at a micro level. You know, for the academic advising department, what are the options available to us, and how do we make sure that the service delivery remains consistent, in tune with the student needs. But those expectations have changed. The students too have learned, and often are very comfortable with a remote meeting for this particular scenario. So just some things to be thinking about, and we're really trying to help prompt that thought process for institutions that are trying to manage through these issues. So just a little bit more around some physical considerations. When we look at, say, that academic advising scenario, do we need individual offices, or can we look at more of an open office arrangement with the opportunity to go into a small conference room where one or two people could meet and address a particular conversation? I wanted to offer these visuals because this is an approach to construction. It's manufactured construction. So this is not the type of thing that needs to take years of planning and, you know, it drops short of the ceiling. It doesn't interfere with sprinkling or your heating and air conditioning distribution. Both of these images accommodate just being moved into the space similar to the way that furniture would be. So it's an installation, an assembly that's brought into the environment and allows a space to be built out in a very short period of time. So you think about this being the space where, you know, the students are being served, and then we look at opportunities for what I call the back of house. So maybe it's the financial aid office that's being represented, or maybe it's the registrar's office. That office can work in a more compact footprint because the goal is for those offices to only have to serve a small fraction of the students that really need that higher level of attention and consideration in the conversation. So looking at ways to not just serve students in a different way, but how can we utilize the footprint of what we have to house things more effectively and efficiently to allow for the institution to save some costs. I apologize, we just got a massive rainstorm in the area. If there's some interference from the noise of the rain in the background, I'll turn it back over to Lee to save us any more of that.
Thank you, Carolyn. So just to wrap up here, wanted to provide a summary slide of some of the typical benefits of shared services. So we've talked a little bit today about cost savings. We touched on opportunities to really improve some of your core business processes, particularly some that the space preferences that have emerged out of the pandemic can help with as well. We talked about how it can help you utilize your space footprint a little more effectively, how it can ultimately improve customer experience and how you can really measure that over time. Related to that is just the overall service delivery quality, and not just the experience that I just talked about for the customer, but also for the employee as well. How do you create meaningful job ladders for employees that help them grow and continue to evolve in their careers? Through effective centers of expertise, you can improve your compliance with key federal, state, and institutional requirements. And ultimately, you tend to improve your data integrity as well, so that you can understand macro trends at the institution and areas that you can focus on for additional quality improvement. So with that, we certainly are happy to take questions that you want to send our way. And Carolyn, I'll invite you back on to help facilitate that portion.
Yes, and Melissa as well, because there may be some questions for you. Billy, has anything come through in the chat?
Yes, we do have some questions. We have a question. Our first question is, has your leadership given a timeline for the space, such as the hotel space for 2 years, then all back on campus? I guess this is directed at Melissa.
So we have not had such a directive at this point. There are student-facing operations, our customer service operation with its front-facing. They have been on campus and fully on campus throughout the pandemic because we had to have those services. We just provided them behind a shield with a mask. And we've also used Sign Up Genius to make sure we stagger that in-person activity, at least in our shared service operation. For the rest of the team doing transactional work, as long as they're performing at or better levels than when we went remote, I don't see us coming back. And that's why I released the space and why we built the hoteling space. That's not going to be the right answer for everybody, but for our transactional back office staff, I've got high levels of documented, data-driven satisfaction stats, both from our customers telling us they're satisfied, as well as the employees saying they're as or better engaged than before we broke for the pandemic. And they tell me regularly how much they value their ability to work remotely. So we do not have a mandate, and I'm grateful for that.
And Melissa, you and I chatted a bit before the session, because given the audience, I thought there might be some interest in understanding, given the occupancy levels, is your facilities team supporting your area through custodial services in a different way than they did pre-pandemic?
Yeah, obviously when you take 50 people out of the equation, right, and you send 40 of them and they're working from their home, they're emptying their own trash and taking care of their own restrooms. So we do have a lighter schedule. I did talk with our physical plant today, and there's a lighter schedule. We actually did end up having to actually furlough some folks over the pandemic, but now as the students are back, now as employment, more employees are on campus, they are at a lower level of custodial services. Lower level meaning there are not as many custodians as there might have been pre-pandemic, because the space is managed differently. In our hoteling space, when folks use the space, we ask them to empty their office can into a central can in the open space. And then that is what custodial services manages. So they're not going to those, what would be 11 different stations. There's one stop, quick, empty and out. So for both recycling and trash. So absolutely, even, so I joke I'm one of 3 people in 7,500 square feet up here. And my can gets emptied every 2 or 3 days, but it's, if it's anything that's going to attract unwanted, I just take it to a different can.
Okay, thank you very much for that answer. Your next question is, how do you handle confidential business functions agreeing to hoteling areas when they have confidential files and activities?
Yeah, so right now we are only opening up the hoteling space to those who work in confidential materials. So we don't keep any files on site. So one thing COVID got us really good at is keeping our files online. We have shredding capabilities for anything so people don't leave unnecessary materials behind. And then we ask that only those who work in confidential materials occupy the space. We did have someone from our military-centered student support group who had access to the space, or she actually has access to the space now. And so we asked for folks to just be respectful of each other's activities in that space.
Okay, thank you for that answer. Our next question is, can you provide a ratio or how you determine the ratio for full in-person to hoteling layout?
Well, I worked very carefully with our planning, design, and construction folks and ended up landing with a 25% space ratio. It was a swag, and it's currently underutilized because folks prefer to work remotely.
I thought I would offer as well. I think it's interesting because at UAB, they have gone back to fully in person. And so all of the one-stop staff there are back in person, but they know that the opportunity for somebody to be working remotely, given how much can still be handled, and the students expect that they don't have to come into the office, that they can use a chat function, that they can use the phone, that they can use email, that all of those things could be handled by somebody remotely if there were a need to. And I think some analysis of traffic, and you saw that both of these functions had very specific transaction counts available. You're able to see peaks to them. They're also tracked on a monthly peaks and valleys. And I think understanding what you need at the peak is as important as what you understand you need at a valley, because the peak may not mean that you need it within an office footprint as much as you need it available, period. It could be a table in a corridor that is addressing some very fundamental types of things that need to be handled in person, but may not need to be handled in a confidential environment. So I think that the tracking that both of these institutions have done serves you well when it comes to kind of anticipating the need going forward, and also always building in that possibility of flexing up or down on a seasonal basis when you know things are going to be more heavily used.
Okay, well, thank you for those answers. And that's the end of our questions. So if we don't have any more questions, more questions coming in. Are other units using this model, departmental units, faculty, facilities management, etc.?
Lee, do you want to take that one?
Absolutely. So yes, we are finding that this model, even though it initially started in higher education with a focus on human resources and core financial transactions, or the student-facing services that we talked about at UAB, we are seeing that it's expanding quite a bit. And so one example of that is that rather than having staff embedded in each of the departments within a school or college, we're seeing some schools and colleges pulling some, not all, but some of those staff into what we tend to call a local support center or a local business center that sits at the college level, but provides shared services to all of the departments within. We are seeing it expand to other functions as well. So there are certainly elements of facility services that are being included in these models. I mentioned procurement earlier. We're even starting to see it expand into areas like marketing and communications and groups like that as well. So you're certainly seeing it really touch almost any administrative function. For those of you who are on campuses that have some substantive research activity, certainly you see this becoming a prominent method of service delivery for both pre-award and post-award activities as well.
Okay, and our next question is, how have you effectively monitored utilization of space? Time space is actually utilized without policing the space or resorting to occupancy sensor/monitors.
Now, Melissa, you have used a system, correct? You mentioned it.
Yeah, so we use Archibus from our planning, design, and construction space to assign space. Now, how it is monitored, I know there's a regular surveying, I don't know if it's annual or every other year, that goes out to make sure assigned space is being used for its designated purpose. For the hoteling space particularly, we're using Sign Up Genius, and I get monthly reporting to know what, who, and the frequency of utilization for the space.
Depending on the campus, I've done some research and identified that some of the space scheduling software like an EMS or Resource 25 has some of that functionality associated with it, so that you can go down to a desk level and use the reservation system that may already exist on your campus, which is another option. Certainly, just sensors in a doorway that count people is fundamental, and certainly they are sophisticated enough now that they are, you're counting in, you're not counting out. So it's not just a passage through a doorway. The most rudimentary is actually, selecting a point in time over 2 weeks, somebody monitors the space. It tends to be fairly clunky, a bit expensive, and not as accurate as using some of the tools that are available. And there's some really great tools out there now that could be deployed to target one space for a month and then redeployed in another area to target space for a month. And it has to do with, Bluetooth connectivity and some of those types of things that allow you to determine how many devices. You use a factor then to determine that, if I brought 4 devices with me, you wouldn't count me as 4 people. You would still need to figure out a way of determining it be down to 1. But there's a fair amount of sophistication in the market right now that's not tremendously expensive, nor does it get down to individual identification, which is where so much of the sensitivity is right now. Like, I don't want you to know it's me in the space, but I'd like you to know that the space is occupied. 2 different things. And I think the tools in the marketplace are continuing to improve to make them accessible from a cost and, skipping the invasion of privacy feeling that some may have.
Okay, thank you. I believe that is the end of our questions. So I'd like to thank our presenters today for taking time to put this very informative presentation together, and appreciate the time it took to put it together. And to our attendees, as always, thank you so much for having taken time out of your work schedule to be with us today. So until next time, be safe, stay healthy, and be kind to one another. Until next time, goodbye.
Thanks, Billy. Bye-bye.